What's the best way to get rid of our visceral fat? Is it to cut carbs from our diet? Or is it to choose specific types of carbs? Today we're going over one of the most interesting trials I've seen in a while, and it addresses all of these questions at the same time. Visceral fat is fat that accumulates around and inside our viscera, our organs, like the liver and the pancreas, as opposed to subcutaneous fat, which tends to deposit under the skin. And visceral fat is the bad guy when it comes to causing metabolic issues like type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. So a group of scientists set out to find the best diet to reduce visceral fat. They took a group of obese patients and they split them three ways. One group was told to cut carbs from their diet. The other two were told to choose specific types of carbs. One was told to favor carbs from whole foods, unprocessed, so fruits, potatoes, and other tubers, whole grains that have not been ground to flour, things like brown rice, rolled oats. And the third group could actually eat carbs that had been processed into flour. So pasta, some baked goods, instant oats. We're not talking ultra processed foods. We're not talking a ton of added sugars. So they're still eating whole carbs. Nothing's been removed. Nothing's been added that's too artificial, but there's more processing like grinding, for example. So we got the low carb group asking the carb quantity question, and then we got the two higher carb groups asking the carb quality question. This is a fascinating design for this trial. It's unusual to see a trial like this, but I love it. They ran this trial for 1 year. We'll look at some more details of the diets. What did they exactly eat? And then we'll look at the results. So first, here's what they were shooting for. This is what they asked them to do. Same calories across, 2,000 for women, 2,500 for men daily. So it's isocaloric, all three groups. Same protein across, about 17% of calories coming from protein, matched across the three groups. Now, carbs, obviously different. 8% of calories from carbs in the low carb group. That was the goal. 45% of the other two. So huge difference. And the rest of the calories obviously coming from fat. So 75% on low carb and then 38% on the other two. Added sugar, they were shooting for low added sugar on all three groups. Under 1% of calories on low carb, and also under 1% on the unprocessed carbs group, and under 5% in the processed carb group. As far as the types of fat, big difference in saturated fat. About 10 to 12% of calories in the higher carb groups, whereas the lower carb group was shooting for about 30% of their calories coming from saturated fat. All three groups were told to eat fish a couple times a week, dairy a couple times a week, and at least half a kilo daily of fruits and vegetables. No sugary drinks, those were discouraged, and artificial sweeteners were also discouraged. So those were the instructions, those were their marching orders. Now, it's not a mouse study, so you have a limited amount of control over what they do when they're living at their homes, right? So one thing is what they were asked to do, another thing is what they actually reported eating. So actual reported intake of protein, 16 to 17% of calories in all three groups. No significant difference, so that's good. They report sticking to the prescriptions. Here's the reported carb intake. The two higher carb groups stayed about steady with their carb consumption, 40 to 45% of their calories coming from carbs. The low carb group went to about 10% of calories from carbs at the 3-month mark, and then slowly rose with time to about 15-ish at the 12-month mark. So this isn't exactly what they asked them to do, but it's pretty darn close. I mean, this is as good as it gets in a free living trial. And then fat, mirror image of the carbs as we'd expect, about steady at 40-ish on the higher carb groups and about 70 on low carb, and then slowly dropping to about 65. The added sugar stayed low, 1 to 2% of calories on the processed high carb and less than 1% on the other two diets. So that's good. Fiber was 20 grams a day before the trial, went up to about 32 on the processed high carb, about 40 on the unprocessed high carb, and about 18 on the low carb. And saturated fat was around 13% of calories on the processed high carb, 11 to 12 on unprocessed high carb, and about 30 on low carb. And then interesting observation with the calories, on most groups, they reported not changing caloric intake significantly compared to before the trial. The exception was the unprocessed high carb group, where they reported cutting back 300 calories a day, which was about 11% of their daily intake. So that's what they reported actually eating. Let's look at the bottom line, the juice. What are the results? Starting with the visceral fat. On the left, before the study, red is processed high carb, yellow is unprocessed high carb, blue is low carb. 6-month mark, clear drop on all three. Seems like a little less effective on the processed high carb. The other two seem about identical. So we got about a 15 to 20% reduction in visceral fat, which is pretty respectable. And then 1 year, about similar. The differences here are not significant at 1 year. This is liver density, so that's a correlate of liver fat. If you lose fat in the liver gets denser, so it goes up in all three as expected. So they drop liver fat. That's similar to what we saw with the visceral fat, kind of confirms that. This is subcutaneous fat, so not in and around the organs, but right under the skin. And it also comes down on all three diets. Processed high carb seems to be a bit less effective. And then total abdominal fat, that's the sum of the subcutaneous and the visceral, and it looks similar to what we saw before. Finally, here's total body metrics. So body weight, similar to what we saw, comes down on all three diets, maybe a bit less on the processed high carb, but no significant difference at 1 year. At 6 months, there is a significant difference between the low carb and the processed high carb. Otherwise, no significant differences. And waist circumference, similar story overall. So these are really interesting results, and they seem to indicate that the main factor to lose visceral fat is to lose weight in general, to lose fat in general, not so much the nutrient content. The results are pretty similar across groups, especially the unprocessed high carb and the low carb, even though there's a big difference in actual nutrient content and intake. Basically, all three diets lowered visceral fat, probably because all three were made up of whole foods, not ultra-processed foods, not a ton of added sugars or refined grains. We talked about the calories. They report cutting back on calories on the unprocessed high carb, not the other two. That's kind of interesting because they're losing weight on all three diets. It's possible that there's some misreporting there, some lack of accuracy. That's a possibility. If we accept the values as reported, on one hand, it would suggest that the unprocessed high carb diet might be a little more satiating, so that they're satiated with fewer calories. On the other hand, maybe if they were all matched for calories precisely, maybe the low carb would edge out a bit. That's a possibility. Another thing to point out is they went for a version of low carb that's pretty high in saturated fat, very high, 30% of calories. And we have substantial evidence that unsaturated fats are better, especially for liver fat. To lose liver fat, they're a little more effective than saturated fats. We have a number of randomized trials doing that comparison directly. And so there's a possibility here that if the low carb diet favored unsaturated fats, olive oil, avocados, nuts and seeds, fatty fish, things like that, maybe you'd see even more impressive results on the low carb. Possible. One caveat of this trial is they lost a lot of participants during follow-up. So they started out with about 190 total, and they ended up with about 60. So they lost like 2/3 of the participants, which is very significant. And it's a concern sometimes when that happens, when you have a big attrition rate. That's what we call when you lose people, it can skew the results. So that's a caveat. The authors basically conclude that their results support recommending different diets based on personal preference. Basically, they're saying all three diets worked. It's whatever you prefer. And I generally agree with that takeaway. The three diets look pretty similar. If there's a difference there, it's small. And we know the number one problem with these things, with weight loss and these metabolic changes, is holding on to the gains long term. A lot of times people get exciting results with a new diet initially and then fall off the horse and put the weight back on. So yeah, key thing is finding a diet that's sustainable for you long term and delivers the results. And speaking of which, here's how well they were able to adhere to each diet. 3-month mark, low carb had the best adherence, 80%. Almost the same for unprocessed high carb, and a little lower for the processed high carb, surprisingly, 70%. By 6 months, they're all very similar in the low 70s. And by 1 year, it's flipped a bit. Processed high carb still on 70, but the other two have dropped. Unprocessed high carb 67 and low carb 63. These differences are not statistically significant, so it's all trends. But yeah, if you find a diet really easy at first and then you fall off the horse with time, that's normal. It doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you did things wrong. It means you're human. Just don't go back to the junky diet that created the problem in the first place, right? Try different tweaks or try something else that works for you long term and is still health promoting, delivers the results you want. Did you know you can reverse diabetes with diet? Check it out. in this video right here. I'll meet you in there. Take care.